I never believed in ghosts. Honestly, I always thought stories about them were just make-believe, spooky tales for impressionable people. But after what happened to me at that hotel, my confidence wavered. Now I can't shake the feeling that they really do exist. It was autumn. The rain had been drizzling since early morning. The road was wet, and the gray clouds weighed down on my mind, creating a strange sense of unease. I was driving through unfamiliar territory, tired and exhausted. The GPS confidently indicated that the nearest town was still a few hours away, and my energy was running low. I knew I couldn't drive any further. My eyes were heavy, and a fog filled my mind. That's when I noticed an old sign by the road, Old Wind Hotel. Rooms available. Turning onto a side road, I saw the building, a grand but weathered structure with a tall facade adorned with wrought iron balconies. The lights in the windows glowed dimly, almost muted, and the hotel seemed like it was from another time. Despite its gloomy appearance, I had no other choice. Staying in the car for the night seemed far worse. I turned off the engine and, with my hands in the pockets of my jacket, made my way to the entrance. The heavy wooden doors creaked open. Inside it was warm, but there was a scent of something old, wood, wax, and something faintly like smoke. The lobby looked grand. Antique furniture, a large chandelier flickering with dim light, and a long reception desk. Behind the desk stood a man in his 50s. He was thin, with a pale face and deep wrinkles on his forehead. His gaze was a little distracted, but when he noticed me, he seemed to perk up slightly. "Good evening," he said in a quiet, steady voice. "Do you need a room?" "Yes," I replied. "A single?" He nodded silently, opened an old, worn-out register, and ran his finger down the list. "We have one available. Second floor, room 207. I signed some paper, paid for the room, and he handed me the key, a real, heavy one with a worn copper tag. It was nothing like the modern plastic cards. "Breakfast is from 7 to 10, he added. "The elevator is not working. The stairs are to the left of the desk." I thanked him and headed upstairs, feeling his gaze on me. It seemed like he wanted to say something, but changed his mind. The staircase was covered with an old carpet that slightly bounced underfoot. The second-floor corridor was eerily quiet. The lighting was dim, with lamps flickering, casting strange shadows on the walls. Room 207 was at the end of the hall. I inserted the key into the lock, turned it, and the door creaked open. Inside, it looked fairly cozy. A bed with a tall headboard, an old dresser, and a mirror in an ornate frame. The only thing I didn't like was the painting on the wall. It depicted a group of people in old-fashioned clothes, standing against the background of the hotel. They all had serious expressions, and it felt like they were staring directly at me. I tiredly tossed my bag into the corner undressed and collapsed onto the bed. My head was buzzing from the drive, and my eyelids felt heavy. I only planned to rest for a bit before sleep, but soon I drifted into a deep slumber. I was awakened by a strange sound, a creak, barely audible but distinct. It was coming from somewhere behind the door. I propped myself up on my elbows and listened. The corridor seemed empty, but suddenly I felt uneasy, like someone was out there, just behind the door. I stood up, approached the door, and cautiously opened it. There was no one in the hallway, just the trembling light of a lamp, casting odd shadows on the walls. Looking to the right, I noticed that the door at the far end of the corridor was slowly closing. As if someone had just left my room, a chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to breathe out. Fatigue, imagination, an old hotel. All of these were affecting my perception. I convinced myself that it was just my imagination. Returning to the room, I locked the door, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I lay back on the bed but couldn't sleep. It felt like someone was watching me from the darkness. And then out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement in the mirror. My heart clenched. I slowly turned my head. In the reflection, something was standing behind me. I spun around quickly, nothing was there. But when I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was gone. After that night, I couldn't sleep. Something was wrong with this place. I could feel it in my skin, every nerve in my body. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while the flickering light of the lamp cast eerie shadows on the walls. Creak. That sound again, but now it was closer. I sat up sharply. The source of the noise was at the door. I listened, trying to figure out if it was a real sound or a trick of my overactive imagination. The door looked closed, but the feeling was as if someone was standing behind it, listening to me, waiting. I carefully got out of bed, approached the door, and pressed my ear against it. Silence. Only the faint hum of the old building. I exhaled. Probably just the fatigue. But as soon as I turned away, the doorknob slowly turned. I froze. Time seemed to stand still. A cold fear gripped my body. The door was locked, but the knob kept turning. Someone was trying to get in. I stepped back, grabbed a chair, and pressed it against my chest as if it could protect me. The door jerked, as though someone had pushed against it harder. I was about to scream when everything suddenly stopped. Complete silence. No footsteps, no sounds. A knock at the window. I jumped and quickly turned around. My room was on the second floor. Who could be knocking at the window? I slowly approached it, peered through the glass, and saw no one. Just the dark courtyard, covered in fog, and an old street lamp casting a faint light on the wet ground. But in the reflection of the window, I saw a figure standing directly behind me. I spun around quickly, but no one was there. Panic tightened my chest. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the room. Everything was in its place except one thing, the painting on the wall. It was now hanging crookedly. I didn't remember it being like that before. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The people in the painting, they had changed. Now they weren't just looking ahead, they were looking directly at me. I slowly reached for the painting and took it off the wall. Behind it, on the old wallpaper, there was a darkened piece of paper nailed with tacks. I ripped it off, and in that moment, the lamp flickered. On the paper was a drawing, childish, uneven. It depicted a person standing in my room, and there was a caption, "He's behind you." At that moment, the lamp went out, and in the darkness, a whisper echoed. The darkness swallowed the room, and fear squeezed my chest with icy fingers. The whisper I had heard was unlike any ordinary sound. It seemed to penetrate straight into my mind, making my heart beat so hard that I felt it thudding in my throat. With a trembling hand, I groped the wall for the light switch. The bulb flickered to life, but now the light seemed dimmer, as though it was being absorbed by some invisible darkness. Everything was in place, except for one thing. The door to the hallway was ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it. This meant that someone had been in my room, or something. Goosebumps ran down my skin, but curiosity overpowered the fear. I slowly approached the door and peered outside. The narrow corridor stretched in both directions, illuminated by scattered wall lamps that flickered as if they were breathing. But something was wrong. The corridor had grown longer. I had stayed in a regular hotel, and I knew for certain that after my room, there were only 3 doors, then a turn. But now the dark passageway seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with identical doors. I swallowed. This couldn't be real. My legs carried me out of the room. I stepped into the corridor, and in that moment, the lights went out. For several seconds, there was total, all-consuming darkness. And then, at the far end of the corridor, something began to move. I couldn't make out the details, just a silhouette, tall, elongated, as though its body had been unnaturally stretched. It swayed slowly from side to side before taking a step forward. I stepped back, trying to find the doorknob of my room. My fingers slid across the wood, but there was no knob. The wall was smooth. The creature moved faster. I could hear heavy, dull footsteps. Too heavy, too resonant, as if they were echoing through the entire corridor at once. I turned and ran. The doors flashed on either side of me, but none had numbers. No signs. No indication that there could be an exit behind them. The corridor didn't end. A loud breath echoed from behind me. It sounded as though its source was right behind me. I lunged forward, racing toward the only door ahead of me. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light streamed from it. I rammed my shoulder into it, burst inside, and slammed the door behind me. Inside was the same room as mine, identical in every way, but without a window. On the bed was a suitcase. My suitcase. But this wasn't my room. I slowly approached it and opened it. Inside were clothes, my belongings, but they looked old, as if they had been lying there for decades. Knock, knock, knock. A knock at the door. Quiet. Cautious. I didn't move. Knock, knock, knock. The knock came again. Longer. Harder. And then the door began to open. Through the crack, someone looked in, someone who looked like me. I froze. The figure behind the door slowly tilted its head, and I realized it really did resemble me. But not quite. Its face was blurred, like a reflection in an old, tarnished mirror. The eyes, they weren't there. Just two black voids, in which an unnatural light seemed to flicker. The door kept opening, even though I hadn't moved a muscle. Panic took hold of me, but my body didn't obey. I couldn't run or scream. The creature took a step forward. I closed my eyes, expecting something terrible to happen, but nothing did. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. The door remained open. Before me, the endless corridor stretched out once more. But now, something had changed. The light in the lamps had taken on a reddish tint, and the air was filled with a faint whisper. I tried to find the door to my room again, but the corridor, it had changed. The doors were no longer in the same places. Some looked old, peeling, with streaks of dark liquid dripping down them, while others seemed completely new. But none of them looked familiar. "This isn't my hotel," I whispered, realizing the full horror of what was happening. "But if this isn't my hotel, then where am I?" I took a few steps forward, listening. The whisper grew louder. I realized it wasn't coming from somewhere far away. It was all around me. I could feel it by my ear, as if hundreds of invisible voices were speaking directly into my mind. "He sees us. He feels us." My heart started beating faster. Suddenly, one of the doors on the left creaked open a little. A faint light shone through the crack. The light of an ordinary lamp. I didn't know what was worse, staying in this nightmarish corridor or stepping into the unknown room. But something inside me told me that if I lingered here for even a second longer, the hotel would swallow me whole. I stepped inside. The room looked lived in. Crumpled sheets lay on the bed. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat on the table. A suitcase stood in the corner. And everything, it all looked oddly familiar. I approached the suitcase and opened it. Inside was clothing. My clothing. I checked the pockets. In one of them, I found an old, worn-out photograph. It was of me, but the photo was faded, as if it had been taken years ago. "This is impossible," I breathed out. At that moment, the light in the room flickered. Shadows on the walls began to move, as if coming to life. Something in the darkness started whispering my name. I turned sharply and saw my reflection in the mirror, but it didn't move with me. It was staring directly at me and smiling. I took a step back. The reflection stayed in place. Then, it slowly raised its hand and tapped on the glass. Knock, knock, knock. The hotel was watching me. I froze, staring at my reflection. It didn't move. The smile on the face in the mirror seemed alien, unnatural. "You're not real," I whispered, but my voice trembled. The reflection blinked. No, it vanished for a moment, then reappeared. Now its lips were moving, but I couldn't hear any sound. It was saying something important. I took a step closer, and then the light went out. I was plunged into total darkness. My heart was racing, and I could hear the dull thumping of blood in my ears. Suddenly, I heard a creak. The door behind me slowly opened. "No," I exhaled. But there was no choice. I couldn't stay here, in this room with the disappearing reflection. I stepped out. The corridor changed again. Now it was old, peeling walls, dirty, faded carpets on the floor, and light barely filtering through rusted lamps. Ahead, I heard the sound of something falling. I held my breath and cautiously walked forward. The hotel lived its own life. Whispers echoed in the walls. The floorboards creaked. Distant footsteps sounded. I could feel it watching me. Around the next corner I saw them. Figures. Shadows stood along the walls. Tall, motionless, they seemed to be a part of the hotel. Their faces were indistinguishable, but I knew they were looking directly at me. "He's a stranger here," someone whispered. The figures moved. I stepped back, but they didn't pursue me. They were moving somewhere, their movements smooth and unreal, as if they were gliding across the floor. I followed them. They led me to a huge door, ancient, dark oak, with twisted patterns that seemed strangely familiar. I reached out and pushed it. The door gave way, opening into a hall that could not possibly belong to this hotel. Towering ceilings, cracked walls, old chandeliers covered in cobwebs. In the middle of the hall stood a figure, a woman in an antique dress. She was pale, her hair long and tangled, her eyes, two deep voids. "You've finally come," she whispered. I didn't know who she was, but I felt like I had met her before. Maybe in a past life, maybe in another dream. "What do you want?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed toward a huge mirror on the wall. I turned my head and saw myself, but not as I should have been. The person in the mirror looked tired, aged. His eyes were empty. I understood. I had been here before. The woman took a step closer. "Leave. Now. While you still can." The shadows around her began to move. They slowly stretched toward me. I turned and ran. I ran without looking back. The corridors twisted like a maze. Doors vanished, walls shifted. And suddenly I was back in my room. The bed was made. The suitcase was by the door. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew it had happened. And the hotel had let me go only because I remembered it. I grabbed my things and rushed out of the room. I ran downstairs and dropped the keys at the counter. No one stopped me. I stepped outside and breathed in the cold morning air. The hotel loomed behind me. It felt like it was watching, bidding farewell. I would never return here. But here's the strange part. When I opened my phone to call a taxi, I saw a notification. "Thank you for staying with us again. We're always waiting for you." The word "again" haunted me, because this was my first time staying at this hotel. But I must have been missing something, because the hotel never forgets its guests. And with that unsettling thought, I headed home. Like and subscribe to the channel. More interesting stories are coming your way.